So welcome to this third session of the afternoon. Our speaker is David Card, who does not need any introduction, except that he is very popular in France because he showed that the minimum wage should be increased. And so everybody loves him here. I'm not so sure about the US. And you have 50 minutes.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me. I have spoken in France once before. In 1983, I gave a talk in Professor Malenvaux's famous seminar. I was never invited back, so I guess it didn't go well.
Because you spoke after Malenvaux. And there was a social norm at that time.
Anyway, so today I'm going
to talk... It cost me a lot, too.
Today I'm going to talk about sort of overview some research, some of which I have done and which others have done, looking at the role of firms in labor market inequality and outcomes more generally. And the sort of motivating slide here sort of is motivated by my discussions with my three brothers who are sort of what you might call middle-class workers or lower middle-class workers in Canada. And basically most people who are not economists fundamentally believe in the idea of a quote-unquote good job. And economists have always struggled with the idea of what's a good job. It doesn't really make sense, especially from a more human capital perspective. But if you think also about things like local development policies, a lot of that is devoted to the idea, city governments and state agencies and so on, really do seem to believe that there's certain kind of firms that they would like to attract. And so what I'm going to try and talk about today is motivated in part by this question of what exactly is a good job. And I'm going to argue that empirically, as far as I can tell in most European countries and elsewhere as well, a good job is essentially associated with a certain type of firm. Firms offer systematic wage premiums, so pay more or less relative to other firms in the labor market. And variation in these premiums is significant. As far as we can tell, it's been growing over time in a number of different countries. The sources of these premiums is somewhat unclear. It is definitely the case that they're positively correlated with profitability of firms. There may be other sources of variation. I'll talk a little bit about some sort of simple theoretical models that you can make that connection from. And I'm going to argue that the existence of these firm wage premiums and the way they're distributed across workers helps to explain many aspects of labor market outcomes and behaviors that are otherwise a bit puzzling for kind of a standard model. So I'm going to go through background. I'm going to talk about some evidence from various studies around the world. And then I'm going to talk at the end about some things that I think where this research could go. So as by way of background, when people are thinking about how to model the labor market for a lot of questions, they adopt a very straightforward model where there's essentially horizontal supply curves to every firm. So there's not really a such thing as firm-specific pay. Each firm essentially takes the wage structure as given and has to pay the workers that it wants to hire a so-called market wage. In fact, in the most basic model with constant returns to scale, there's not even really any firms. So most of the standard analysis of things like trade and immigration, skill bias technical change, human capital, minimum wages, occupational choice, most of those models actually work with essentially 100% the supply side. In those models, you can ignore the demand side completely. And there's a reason for that, I think, empirically, which is we didn't used to have hardly any information on the demand side. We had a lot of information on the supply side, so we had population census surveys and things like that. So it was convenient and logically consistent to have this class of models as the building block for that analysis because you didn't really need to know anything about the employer. There's a modern version of this kind of model that's pretty important in trade for example. And in this class of models, there's multiple skill groups, but workers are highly mobile across firms. Firms differ in attributes like entrepreneurial skill, ability, and so on. So there can be quite a bit of heterogeneity within a given industry about the firm. But there's no special link between an individual worker and a particular employer. And the way I explain this to my undergraduates at Berkeley is it doesn't actually matter if you live in Silicon Valley whether you work for Google or not. It's the presence of Google in that market that influences the wages for everyone, whether you work there or not. And that will strike most people who aren't economists as completely counterintuitive and factually incorrect. So this research about connecting workers to firms is meant to try and sort of fill that gap. So I'm going to now do a brief review of a long history of research on this set of topics, and I'm not going to do it much justice because I think either you know a lot about this or you can read about it if you ever care to learn about it. So there was, in the 1960s and 70s and into the 1980s, there was a lot of research using firm-level data trying to associate firm-specific outcomes to the union contracts that they negotiated. And actually, this is the kind of research that I did in the 1980s. A lot of labor economists did this work. And that research showed that firms, as they became more profitable, set higher wages for their workers. And so there was obviously a connection between the negotiated contract wage and the profitability of firms. And it also showed that wage structures at a given firm tended to be influenced by structures at other firms. There was these patterns of wage setting that seemed to be important, and it was slow to adjust. So there was a presumption, and a lot of that literature was really motivated by the notion that there might be relative rigidity in those wages that was causing the labor market to adjust slowly and leading to some underemployment, particularly with negative shocks. Second round of research got started in the 1970s as panel data sets became available, and two data sets that probably you are familiar with, the panel study of income dynamics and national longitudinal study of youth. These data sets followed the same worker over time. Now, they didn't actually ask who you were working for. What they did ask is, are you working for the same employer you were working with a year ago or 2 years ago? And that allowed researchers to construct calendars with information on this person's on job 1, now they're on job 2, now they're on job 3. We didn't know very much about that job. Maybe the industry that job was in, maybe the size of the employer, maybe whether it was covered by union contract. But that research showed that there was a very large job component of the wage that an individual worker received. So it showed that if a worker was moving between jobs, that would be a significant shift, and you could sort of find a systematic share there. And that continues to influence research. For example, Pistafari and others have worked a lot on models of wage setting in which this firm-specific component of the wage is a significant source of risk because you stand to lose that if your current employer lets you go or you somehow have to lose that job. Another body of work that emerged in the 1980s and then into the 1990s became quite important is research on displaced workers. This is research which was largely using administrative data sets, but some survey data sets, and documented that individuals would appear to have large and very persistent wage losses if they lost a job at an employer that closed down or had a significant labor force reduction. And it was a major source of puzzle, actually, in that literature, and still controversial to this time, how to interpret that. Why would it be that an individual would lose a job at one firm and then appear not to be able to get another job that was paying as much as that for quite some time or maybe never? And there's different, I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end. There's different interpretations of that. Finally, there's a fourth body of research which is not really mostly done by labor economists but by productivity economists, which looks at firm-specific outcomes. We saw some of this kind of work this morning, actually. So you're looking at firm-level data on things like the overall wage bill. You can measure something like TFP, or you can measure value added per worker, or things like that. And what you always find, no matter how hard you dig into this and how hard you try to control for factors, is there's enormous variability across firms, even in the same very narrow sector, in something like productivity. And that's also a puzzle. And some of the research on the firm side from the labor market perspective is probably motivated by the fact that fundamentally the labor market is inheriting a lot of inequality from this side of the labor market. So if there's very different productivities of firms, somehow that's getting translated down to the workers. Okay. Now, there's a coexisting body of theoretical work that is built up over the last 30 years or so, which is due to many different people, including many people working in France. So Mortensen and Burdett did the first equilibrium job ladder model. back in the early 90s. This is a model where firms there's a mixed equilibrium in wage setting space. Each firm posts a wage. Firms can have multiple levels of wages, all of which are equally profitable. And workers are moving over time up the job ladder, and at any given point in time can lose their position on the job ladder and fall back down to a lower level. So that's class of models, which I think is actually quite insightful. It motivates a lot of the research that people are doing on the empirical side. So thinking of the labor market as consisting of something like this job ladder structure. I think a lot of labor economists think that. In the macro side, the DMP model, which is also partially written by Del Mortensen, is more pervasive. That's a model where there is, in fact, a firm-specific component of pay, but it's actually job-specific. So it's really more something that arises from an idiosyncratic match between a particular worker and a particular firm. So in that class of models, there isn't necessarily a such thing as a firm-wide wage premium, whereas in the Mortensen-Burdett model, it's specifically set up to be a firm-wide thing. And there's a lot of interesting extensions of, particularly of the DMP class of models, to look at responding to outside offers and individual bargaining and so on. Okay, there's another strand of work which probably most people have not seen very much, but is been kind of percolating along underneath. And I call this here the modern rent-sharing literature. This is a literature, empirical literature, which is specifically asking a question: how connected are the wages of a worker to the profitability of its employer, of his or her employer? And the original set of research that was done in this area was research at the very high level, looking at, say, the industry level profitability and wages. And maybe you're familiar, if anybody's over 50 years old, they're familiar with this big literature that emerged in the 1980s on the industry wage premiums and so on. This is kind of a version of that, but now there's two improvements in this literature. One is that you've got individual specific workers attached to their particular employer, and you're following, in this literature, they're following the worker over time. So it's the same worker as the firm becomes more and less profitable. I will refer to that throughout this talk as a job stayer design, because it's a design where I'm staying at the job, and the job becomes more, the firm becomes more profitable or less profitable, and then my wage is going to adjust. And so this literature is attempting to see what's the elasticity of that adjustment. And it's a very important feature of this literature that they're actually looking at differences in wages for the same worker over time, because that's going to difference out this enormous heterogeneity. And there's no question that when you're thinking about this enormous heterogeneity in firms, it's mirrored by a corresponding heterogeneity in workers. There's a lot of assortative matching between highly productive firms and more highly skilled workers. And some of that skill will be unobservable to the outside observer or econometrician. And so you're ordinarily going to see a strong confound between wages of workers and profitability of firm. But this design is meant to overcome that. And I'm going to now just show you a little table of some of the recent papers in this literature. The typical elasticity you get in this literature is around 5 to 10%. There's reasons to be suspicious or shall we say, reserved about each of the individual studies. But I think as a whole, they do suggest that either there's a very pervasive pattern of publication bias going on, or there is something going on in terms of this connection. And I'm going to then show you a replication, which I did with Ana Ruth Cardozo from Barcelona, and my colleague Pat Klein and Jörg Heinig from Germany, where we take this Portuguese data set and we essentially redo this exact exercise. And my feeling is we didn't really try and cheat. We basically just did exactly what everybody else did to try and see how it works. So, and we're going to get more or less the same. So here's a bunch of studies. This is 20 estimates of the elasticity of individual wages with respect to changes in firm-specific value added per worker over time. That's sort of my preferred, easily implementable empirical measure of profitability. Some of these are from French data. The early research was up in 2000 by David Margolis and a colleague. There's Swedish, Italian, Belgian, Portuguese, German, and Danish. You can see One really important feature of this data, this research, and one reason why it hasn't really busted into the American journals probably is because it doesn't have any American data. Always a problem. But you can see that, despite a lot of differences across these studies, there's kind of a systematic tendency for a positive coefficient. And relative to other literatures, for instance, I've done a meta-analysis of the active labor market program literature. Relative to other literatures, this is a very tight range of elasticities. There's no crazy numbers here like 1.2 or -3, okay, which you would widely see in like labor supply studies, for example. So this is an analysis that's tried to reproduce that we did with Portuguese data. Portugal has a very unusual feature which came about because of the aftermath of their Carnation Revolution. Once they got rid of the dictator, they kind of had a social movement to have kind of open information. And one of the features of that social movement was there was going to be in every job site a list of every employee and their wage. Totally awesome. It's like working at Berkeley. You might not know, but you can look us all up. So that data was collected by the Portuguese Department of Labor, and eventually, starting in the 1980s, they made it into a machine-readable data set. Now, it's not exactly the same as a tax-based administrative data set. It is a census of all workers at a point in time. So if somebody's at the same job 1 year to the next, you get to connect them. So that's the data set we're using. And on a route, we're incredibly many long hours connecting that data set to a data set of the publicly available information that is sold by one of the Dutch publishing companies, Bureau van Dijk, on firm accounts data. These are our estimated elasticities. I'm showing you 2 differences in rows and 3 differences in columns. And this is somewhat important because one of the concerns that people have about this literature on connecting firm-specific outcomes to workers is that maybe you're picking up an industry-specific shock, which might be affecting or pricing, changing the price of a set of skills which are idiosyncratic to a particular sector. So what we tried to do here was we have a basic specification with some simple controls, one with something like 25 or 30 industry controls, and another model with detailed industry controls, by which I mean like 400 industry dummies interacted with year. So we're basically filtering out as much as we can the industry level shock and making this a purely firm-specific shock. And I'm comparing an OLS estimate where we're using the change in log value added from 2005 to 2009 to the change in the wages of the employees who stayed at that firm over that same 4-year period, to an IV estimate where we're instrumenting that change with a little bit wider change in sales per worker. We're using that wider bracket in a hope to get rid of some of the measurement error. The firm accounts data is incredibly noisy, especially when you're using the universe of firms rather than the set of publicly traded firms or larger firms which tend to have more carefully audited accounts. And you can see that raises the coefficient estimates. Interestingly, going across the columns, there isn't much attenuation, so it doesn't really look like most of what you're detecting in this literature about a connection between a worker and the fortunes of their firm is really working through the industry route. It's working within industry almost as strongly.
It goes the same way up and down?
Yeah, pretty much.
No evidence of...
Not as far as we can tell, no. He just asked me if it's symmetric. In other words, is it equally... In Portugal during this period, unfortunately, it's almost all down. But on average, but when you control for industry, of course, you're centering it on the mean, right? So, yeah. I don't know if you had data like this from, very long period with high inflation and low inflation regimes, things like that, whether you could find small differences, but it doesn't seem, nothing we could find detected. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is another approach to looking at the connection between workers and firms, and that's the so-called AKM framework. This is actually invented in Paris a long time ago. And this is not really a model. This is a statistical model, okay, in which you just run a giant regression, which, being a labor economist, I'm very comfortable with. Most other people, probably most French economists, are not very comfortable with this, but this is a sort of American approach. So you just run a regression on person dummies and firm dummies and a bunch of X's and an error term. Now, a lot of concern has arisen over the years about what's in the error term. And if you think about that for a moment, you can see that there's a bunch of components there. One thing that's pretty important, at least potentially, especially if you're someone who believes strongly in a DMP style world, where you show up at the door of a firm, you're applying for a job, they put their hand on your forehead and they say 7, so you get 3.5. Okay, that's how a DMP model works. So you get some fraction of the sort of firm-specific extra skill that you bring to the table. In that class of models, there's a job match premium for each individual worker in that error term. Okay? And you might think that that job match premium could be large, and it would also be a driver of mobility. If that was the case, what would happen if you looked at someone who moved from firm A to firm B? Well, on average, someone's moving from firm A to firm B because it pays more. Not always. Sometimes firm A closes down or has a downsizing, but on average that would be true. But if you thought, say, that the typical worker who moved from A to B got a 10% wage increase, in the data, you will almost inevitably, if the firms are relatively large, find lots of people going in the other direction as well, simultaneously. And you might think that the way the labor market works is the people going from A to B are a better match at B, so they get a wage increase. The people going from B to A, so this is, I like to explain this as Stanford and Berkeley. So I moved from Stanford to Berkeley, I would get a 10% wage cut. Somebody would move from Berkeley to Stanford, they would get a 10% wage increase. That would be one model, but an alternative model would be there's an idiosyncratic component so that we both gain. And that's actually a model that is very attractive to economists. It means that the mobility that you see is advantageous for both parties. Okay? That's kind of the idea. So that's a potential thing in there. In addition, there's transitory shocks, so there could be either a firm-wide shock, like the firm is having some transitorily bad period, that's going to influence the wage structure in the error term here, or it could be a worker-specific thing. So somebody has previously been a good worker, and now they're getting into problems with too much drinking, or in the US these days, it's all about too much codeine-based products. Okay, so they're taking too many what do we call those things? Percocets. So too many Percocets. So you're taking too many Percocets. So that person is going to be on a transitory downslide. And you might think, well, what happens if you're doing that is you move from a better job to a worse job. And I would tend to see systematic mobility associated with changes in kind of the latent ability of individual workers. So in a paper that Pat Klein and Jörg Heining and I wrote a couple years ago, we tried to devise some non-parametric evidence on how important is that idiosyncratic component of pay versus the firm-wide component of pay. And this is the way we did it. We said, look, let's classify every job for every worker on the basis of the average wages of your coworker. Okay? And that won't pick up an idiosyncratic component. That only picks up the part that is sort of the average pay premium that this firm pays all of its workers, okay, plus some kind of assortative nature of the quality of the workforce on the whole. And let's look at people who change jobs. And now let's associate people in different buckets depending on whether they left with a firm where all their colleagues were highly paid to one where all their colleagues are low paid, or went in the opposite direction. And so I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs where we select workers who change establishments. So everybody's a job changer. It's an event study design. We're going to classify people by the quartile of coworker pay they started in and the quartile of coworker pay that they ended in. Okay, and here's the data for German men in the period in the early 2000s. And you can see a bunch of interesting patterns here that I want to kind of highlight. So I'm going to go through this. First of all, quartile 4 workers who switch to another quartile 4 firm don't seem to get much of a pay increase, maybe a small increase. And you can see that they're basically, it's as if not much happened to them. Somebody who goes from a quartile 1 firm to another quartile 1 firm likewise doesn't have any pay increase. These are all movers, okay? What about somebody who goes from a 1 to a 2? Now this is going from your coworkers in the bottom quartile to your coworkers in the second quartile. You get a fairly significant wage boost. It's around 10, 15 log points. Okay? If you go from a 1 to a 4, that's all the way to the top, you're going to get something like a 40 log point wage increase on average in this data set. Okay, that's a very large increase in pay for most of us. That's like getting an offer from Harvard if you're like, Berkeley or something. And similarly, on the other hand, people who are at a quartile 4 firm and change to a quartile 1 firm. Now, most of those people, arguably, are not doing this voluntarily. Most of those people are doing this because something happened to that job, okay? And now they're forced to take another job, and they've been forced to take a job at a relatively lower paying firm for the coworkers. And that, you can see that's also a pretty big change, but it's about minus 40 log points, okay? You can also see that the people who are at the group 1 firms and eventually go to group 4 firms are different than the ones who are at group 1 firms and stay at group 1 firms. So there is evidence of permanent heterogeneity here, okay? But there's no evidence of transitory heterogeneity. So notice that everything's kind of flat beforehand and afterwards. So it seems like you can rule out these stories about, you know, I was having problems with too much drinking, and so I am going to be, that would be a story where I was here, and I started to do a lot of drinking, and I go down a little bit, and then, you know, my current employer can't stand it anymore, and they fire me, and then I'm down to group 1. You don't see that evidence. Okay. I want to emphasize, it's not immediately apparent, and I'm not going to show the graphs, but there's a very strong symmetry between the losses of people who go from a 4 to a 1 or a 3 to a 2 and the gains of people who move in the opposite direction. So they're not exactly precisely equal and opposite, but roughly speaking, they're very highly correlated, and they're about qualitatively the same size and magnitude. Okay, this is data for Portugal. I like to show these two together because my friend Christian Dussmann likes to argue that the German labor market is very efficient and functioning well, and thinks that Portugal is like a disaster. This graph doesn't look any different in the two countries. Another exercise you can do, this is using the Portuguese data. I'm going to plot your wage change against the wage change on average for your coworkers, okay? And I'm going to divide everybody up into 20 buckets on the two sides, so there's going to be 400 cells. And this is what the data looks like. You can see that this in the center here are people who are moving but are staying in whatever same bucket they started on. Over here are people who are kind of winning the lottery, so they are moving way, way up. So their average co-workers' wages are like 30, 40 points higher, even 50 and 60 points higher. And then over here is the losers. Nope. Over here are the losers. Now, the thing that you can see from this figure, that's a slope of 1, or excuse me, 0.4. This is pretty symmetric, okay? If you join up those points, you'll see symmetry. All right. So the takeaway is wages rise and fall when you join a firm with higher and lower paid coworkers. There's large gaps. Loss of 40% or 40% wage gain is common. There doesn't seem to be an average mobility premium that's very important. It might be on the order of a couple of percentage points, and it's largely for the highest skilled workers. Okay, so a typical low-skilled worker just moving between jobs, if they stay in the same bucket of coworker pay, does not get a wage increase on average. There's no public jobs in either of these two data sets. Yeah. There's no clear pre- and post-transition, and there is some sorting on the permanent ability component. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick summary of what happens when you apply one of these AKM models. This is men in Germany, full-time men. This is full-time women in... sorry, this is men in Portugal. This is women in Portugal. This is men in Germany. And this is white men in Brazil. Okay, so that's 4 very different labor markets. Arguably, the male and female labor markets in Germany are pretty distinct, actually. And you can see that there's a lot of commonality here. So one way to summarize them is in the bottom rows, I give the share of the variance of log wages due to the different components. And you can see the person effect is pretty important. All right, so no one is denying in this literature that there's a very strong component of individual specific pay determination that persists across jobs. Okay, in Germany, it's a number like 50%. In Portugal, maybe as high as 60%. Returns to education are much higher in Portugal than in Germany. So that's one element of that. The firm effects are about a third as big, but still an important contributor to variance. Okay? And then there's a really interesting phenomenon in all of these data sets, which is there's a positive covariance between these. There's an evidence that firms that tend to pay a higher wage premium on average for the workers tend to be ones that attract firms or workers or retain workers that are going to earn more everywhere. And that is contributing significantly to inequality because it's like the highly skilled guys are getting to go and work at Goldman Sachs. And the low skilled guys are working at a garbage disposal company. right? That's sort of the paradigm that this is sort of representing. You can see a couple other things. The R squared in these models is extremely high, 95%. So for a wage determination model, that's basically as good as it could possibly get. Residual component of variance is very small, even in Brazil, which is a somewhat irregular economy. There's a pretty strong correlation between the female and the male estimated firm effects in Portugal. It's 0.6. You should be aware that the estimated effects here are all subject to measurement error. The measurement error is going to attenuate the correlation between the worker and firm effects and increase the variance probably of the firm effects slightly. And so there's a bunch of new research. Pat Klein's been working on this, and others have been working on this, which suggests that that is probably leading to some bias, but not a huge amount, in the order of 10 or 15%. Okay. So what do we make of these firm-specific wage premiums? Well, one simple explanation would be that they are some kind of compensating differential. And I think that's an important possible explanation for some share of the variance of these things. But on average, high-wage firms survive much longer, and jobs at high-wage firms survive much longer. And so it doesn't look like firms that pay high wage premiums or jobs at firms that pay high wage premiums last shorter or on average the same. If there was a pure compensating diff, if the whole thing was about compensating diffs, there should be no connection with the duration of the job.
Sorry, just so you observe which firm people work in?
Yep. Okay.
But you don't observe the profits of those firms?
Yeah, we do. I'm going to talk about that in a second.
Okay.
Yeah. So these premiums are highly correlated with profitability in the countries that the data has been assembled for. So I've used data from Italy and Portugal that we've assembled some data and connected them. Others have done data analysis from France. And that meta-analysis I showed you at the beginning could be interpreted as evidence of this kind of phenomenon, potentially. There's a modest widening of these premiums over time. For instance, Klein, Heining, and I calculated that that the widening of the firm-specific wage premiums and the increase in assortiveness contributed about a third of the overall increase in wage inequality in Germany between the mid-90s and the 2000s. So it seems like an important component of that. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to talk about in some detail is what's the interpretation of these wage premiums? Is it just rent sharing? Is it something that we can understand a little bit more precisely with some kind of model? So one temptation, I think, a lot of, especially the applied people who've worked in this area, is to just say, well, it's rent sharing, without really thinking much about it. And I've always been very uncomfortable with that idea of rent sharing, in part because I don't really understand why firms share rents. Most people who are not academics don't think of their employer as this, incredibly magnanimous entity that just wants to share. Moreover, in Germany, where we documented this rise in firm-specific wage premiums, that was occurring at precisely the era where union power was really declining quickly, and there was a lot of other institutional changes which were arguably shifting the balance of power very strongly against workers. So you're getting an increase in the importance of these wage premiums at precisely the time when workers are probably losing bargaining power, if anything. So it doesn't look like that's a very useful explanation, or to me it doesn't look very useful. And so one simple explanation is Joan Robinson's monopsonistic wage setting model. So I'm just going to outline a few equations of how that would work. This is basically an adaptation of the off-the-shelf model you would use in I/O for price setting with a differentiated product market. So think about workers as having indirect utility function that depends on the wage relative to some benchmark wage. Workers have a skill group S, and they can potentially work at a firm J. And so the indirect utility is going to depend on the premium paid relative to the benchmark. The advantage of that specification is it gives labor supply functions to the firm that look like this. They become horizontal at very low levels of supply. So they're essentially infinitely elastic at the lowest levels of employment, and then they become steep like that. Okay, I think that's a useful feature of that class of model. And if you've got the standard logit type form, you get this probability equation. If you assume the number of firms competing in the labor market is large, then you can approximate the logit with a Poisson, and you get rise to these very simple firm-specific labor supply functions. which just have a component. This is an elasticity, beta L and beta H for low and high skilled workers, which reflect how willing workers are to trade off unobserved features of the job, idiosyncratic features of the job, versus the wage component of the job. Okay, think about it as that. And that's a supply side. If you've got a firm production function of a standard type with a TFP component outside, and depending on the two types of workers, you're going to get the standard first order conditions, the markdown or markup equations, the standard learner type equations, which say that you're going to mark up or mark down your productivity relative to your wage by a thing that depends on the ratio of the elasticity to 1 plus the elasticity. This is, Robinson derived that in the 1930s. And so if you think of these, if you think of the labor supply elasticities coming from the model as being numbers like 9 or 10, then that would suggest a 10% markup. If you think of elasticities as numbers like 5, that would suggest a 20% markup. That would be the kind of range that I would think would be reasonable, potentially, given what we see in the data. And here's a simple benchmark specification. So let's imagine that the world consists of firms that have firm-specific TFP and then a perfect substitution between high and low-skilled workers. Okay? Now, this is a useful model, but it doesn't really explain why high TFP firms would want to hire more high-skilled workers. So this is not going to be a very good model for working with assortative matching. If you go through the algebra in this class of models, you get something that looks surprisingly useful. So I get an equation for the log wages of the two sets of workers, which depend on some outside wage opportunities, W bar L and W bar H, plus a coefficient in front of a firm-specific measure of wages. So this suggests that it would be technically possible to derive something like an AKM estimating equation from a simple monopsonistic price setting equation. In particular, if beta L is equal to beta H, or approximately equal to beta L, beta H, then the wage premiums paid by a given firm to high-skilled and low-skilled workers will be constant. Okay? If they're roughly similar, then you're going to see the same firm that wants to have a higher premium for low-skilled workers will have a higher premium for high-skilled workers. And this premium is arising not because firms are sharing rents, but because more profitable firms want to hire more workers, and they have to pay higher wages to do that. Exactly for the same reason that demand curves for individual specific products are supposed to slope down. Okay? Now I want to talk a little bit about estimating the connection between wages and profitability. And with that AKM framework, there's a kind of a simple thing you can do. You can break down the log hourly wage in sample into the estimated person effect, the estimated firm effect, a bunch of x betas at a residual. Now, on average, the residual is ignorable, so we don't have to worry about that. And we can regress each of those components on a measure of firm-specific profitability. Okay, now this is different than the previous analysis because I'm not focusing on job stayers. Here I'm focusing on job changers. This is identified by someone who, for example, moves between firms. Okay? This would all disappear if there were no movers, because I can't identify the firm effect and the person effect separately if I don't have movers. And you can see if I just run a regression using log hourly wages, I get that depending on whether I control for industry or not, I get a 0.2 to 0.25 elasticity between wages and value added per worker, which is very high. About 7/18 of that is the correlation at the person effect side. So that is like evidence of a sortativeness on the person characteristic side. And about 10 points of it is on the firm effect side. So this is decomposing that 18% into a combination of a sortativeness on the person's skill and what you could think of as some kind of connection between the pay that the firm is offering and the premium that it pays, which is precisely what that previous model would suggest. Okay. That model, just to remind you, suggests that it's possible that the premium that a firm pays for different skill groups is different depending on the skill group. How does that work empirically? Well, it turns out if you, for example, take the Portuguese data set and divide up the men into highly educated and less educated, estimate separate models, that the degree of correlation between the estimated firm effects and value added per worker for the high-skilled and the low-skilled is about the same. Pretty surprising. This is a visual version of that same finding. On the x-axis, I've got mean log value added per worker divided into 100 cells. So this is a cell level analysis. And I've got the blue dots are the relative wage premium that firms in each bucket are paying for high-skilled versus low-skilled workers. Okay? And you can see that that isn't correlated. As we go to more and more highly productive firms, the wage premium for high-skilled versus low-skilled is not changing, although the relative employment is changing. So we get evidence of assortativeness in terms of employment shares, but we don't get assortativeness in terms of the premiums. Okay? All right, so what features of the labor market can be explained by these firm wage premiums? And I've already mentioned this, the rise in wage inequality. In analysis that Pat and Jorg and I did, we looked at, this is the evolution of wage inequality in Germany from the mid-1990s to the late 2010. And you can see there was an enormous increase in inequality. Real wages at the bottom for the full-time men, this is full-time, this doesn't include mini jobs, fell quite significantly in Germany. This is one of the sources of problems in Europe, that those guys are so lowly paid. And you can see that this decomposition says that of the rise of the variance for full-time men, about 0.04 is due to the rise in the variance of person effect, so an increase in return to skill for workers. About 0.27 is due to a rise in the increasing dispersion in the firm effects, so an increase in these pay premiums. And about 0.38, or a pretty big component, 34%, is due to this assortative matching rising. So there's more assortativeness going on in the German economy. And the same is true for women and for full-time apprentices. We've done an analysis on a route, Pat and I, of looking at the gender gap in Portugal. Here we were interested in the question, okay, different firms have different pay premiums. Do women get disproportionately screened out of the firms that have higher pay premiums? That's one possibility. That's a sorting story. Or when we look across firms, do women actually get a less of an advantage going to a high profitability firm relative to men? That would be something we call a bargaining story in this paper. And we show that most of there's a pretty big gender gap in Portugal. It's around the same as in the US, around 23 log points. And something like 20 to 25% of that is due to the disproportionate non-employment of women at the higher paying firms. Okay? So that suggests that this could be an important phenomenon. We're finding the same general pattern in an analysis of data from Brazil. What about cyclical wage variation? So one of the things that people have always wondered about is why is there good jobs and bad jobs opening at different points appear to be in the business cycle? And so what I'm going to do with this in this next graph is I'm going to show you the change in wages for job changers. Okay? And I'm going to decompose that into two bits. So you change jobs, two things happen to you. One is that you're going to get a change in your firm effect. And one is you're going to get a change in something like the deviation between what you get paid and the predicted amount that you get paid, which I'm going to call a match effect. Okay? And we can look at the quality of new jobs and how that's changing over the business cycle. And so this is data from Germany, looking at the period of the 2000s when there was a pretty big downturn in the German economy at the end of that period, a pretty big boom in the early part of that period, or other way around, excuse me. So you can see the unemployment rate is going up and then down, so that's kind of an S-shaped curve showing a kind of a one business cycle. The wage change for new jobs is in red, okay, and that's pretty cyclical, okay? It's pretty negative when there's high unemployment and it's pretty positive when there's low unemployment. The wage change for continuing jobs is pretty stable. Okay? It has a little cyclical component, but it's quite dampened, and this is a pattern that others have seen in other data sets. And now the contribution of this analysis, how much of this cyclicality we see for the new jobs is because of people systematically having different kinds of changes in a recession versus an expansion. And it looks like a very large chunk, about 80 to 85%. Of the cyclicality in new jobs is because at the bottom of the business cycle, when somebody starts a job, this is not a good time to look for a job if you ever have the choice. This is a better time. Because it looks like on average, you're more likely to be able to shift to a higher firm effect firm in an expansion, and you're more likely to be consigned to a low firm effect firm in a recession. Okay, what about early career progression? So there's a famous paper by Topel and Ward looking at young workers. this is a data set, 1 minute, that looks at how firm effects evolve over age by different types of groups. And you can see that your average firm effect rises as you get older, particularly for the sort of the middle high school educated group in Portugal. This is what about wage losses of displaced workers? This is the last thing I'm going to talk about. It looks like a good chunk of the wage loss that someone suffers as a result of a loss of jobs in a recession is due to the fact that when they get reemployed at a firm with lower firm effects. So this is the wage loss. This is the hourly wage loss. This is the earnings loss that you see in a lot of studies. This is the hourly wage loss, which is on the order of 8 or 9% for full-time men in this period in Germany during that recession we were talking about. And almost all of that is due to a drop in the firm effect. Okay. So what else might be related? I've been doing some work on racial wage premiums in Brazil. It looks like that's a significant factor in understanding the differences in pay between white and non-white workers in Brazil. It's an important factor in immigrant assimilation, and a couple of studies have looked at that. It's probably correlated with the rise in incomes to the top 1%. David Lauder and Larry Katz have a new paper that's looking at that. I think that the firm effect premiums also are connected to lots of other phenomena that are very interesting, like the way that networks for friends work and colleagues in the labor market. So what you really want to have, you don't necessarily want to have friends in the labor market. You want to have friends at firms that have high wage premiums, because that's who's going to get you a good job. And then there's an interesting paper by Kramars and Scans looking at the intergenerational correlation of earnings, which suggests that actually one of the reasons why there's a correlation between fathers and sons' earnings is because if the father has a job at a high firm effect firm, sons are more likely to get that. So I think this is an interesting agenda that's helping to answer some questions from the traditional labor markets perspective.
Okay, is there a question? Yes. You want the microphone?
Okay.
I was curious, when were the Brazilian data collected, please?
So we're using this administrative data set. It's from the period from 1999 to 2010. Yeah. There's some changes going on. Yeah. There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? No. So thank you very much, David, for this presentation.